Welcome to this special edition of Mistrial, where I have an amazing guest here that has agreed to come and speak with us and give us his incredible knowledge. Steve Vladeck is a professor at Georgetown University Law Center, my alma mater, where I went to law school, and he's a nationally recognized expert on federal courts, the Supreme Court, national security law, et cetera, et cetera. He writes books. He has this bi-weekly, I think it's twice a week newsletter that he puts out. It's an unbelievable newsletter. It's all things. It's called One First, and it's a weekly newsletter all about the Supreme Court. So he's one of my go-to people when I am looking to see, oh, what does this mean? What does Steve say about what the Supreme Court's doing and their ruling? You've actually argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. You're one of the extremely smart appellate lawyers that has actually have that distinction, because that's an honor and a distinction that not a lot of people have. So welcome. Thank you for coming. And you had a piece, you're a guest essayist in the New York Times today, and you had a piece about the Supreme Court and Donald Trump. And I really wanted to talk to you about that and anything else you have on your mind. But really, it appears to me that given where we are and the fact that it looks like Trump is going to not only be president, but control the Senate and the House. And of course, we know there's a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. I think a lot of people are wondering, what does that mean? And will his power go unchecked? Does this give him the ability to kind of do whatever he wants? And so I just would love to hear your thoughts on this and tell people exactly where we are and what's going on.
Sure. So I think, Karen, it really is two different questions. I think the first question is, can the Supreme Court check Donald Trump? And then the second question is, will it? And let me take the second question first. I know that folks have become pretty cynical and pretty jaded about the Supreme Court, and I understand why that's happened. But it's worth remembering that at least during President Trump's first term, where you had at least a 5-justice majority of Republican appointees, Trump didn't actually do that well. The court blocked the second iteration of the travel ban. The court stopped President Trump's administration from putting a citizenship question on the 2020 census. The court blocked Trump's rescission of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Immigration Program. Trump lost both of the major subpoena disputes that went to the court in 2020. And, during the 2020 election cycle, the court really sat on its hands, even as it was presented with a number of opportunities to try to, enable, Trump and his supporters to challenge the election results. So, Karen, I think I start from the premise that this court won't necessarily be inclined to rule against all or much of what a second-term President Trump would do, but that it will at least be inclined to rule against some of it, whether that's, Trump's plan to revoke birthright citizenship for children of undocumented immigrants, or his plan to go after the civil service. And so then that raises the hard question, which is, assuming that there are big cases where there are 5 or 6 votes, say, to rule against former President Trump and soon to be President Trump, what if Trump just ignores them? What if Trump tells the Supreme Court to pound sand? And I think what's really striking about that question is that had that happened during Trump's first administration, I think, there would have been a huge public reaction. I think it would have been potentially fatal to his prospects for re-election in 2020. But it's not clear at all to me, if that were to happen in a second Trump administration, where the pushback would come from, or who would stand up for the court. And Karen, I think the question is, how did we get here? What happened between 2019, 2020, and today that got us to a point where, if a second-term Trump ignores the Supreme Court, it's not as obvious to me that there would be a huge outcry and a public rallying around the court.
So you bring up just an incredibly just shocking, I would say, point, right? What comes to mind is when I was born in a long time ago, and I was a rule follower since the minute I was born. That's just who I am deep down. And I remember the first time, my mom would tell me, or my dad would say, come home at this hour, do this, do that. It would never. And I remember the first time one of my siblings, just basically, as we're teenagers, said to my mom, no, and walked out the door. And I just remember thinking, that's an option? You can do that? And that's what comes to mind when I read your article, when you said, what if Trump ignores the Supreme Court? I thought, what are you talking about? Like, how could that be? How can he ignore the Supreme Court? So that's what the premise of your article is that even if the Supreme Court does rein him in, he has to follow what they say. But you're saying it's possible that he doesn't. Has that ever happened before? Has there ever been a president that ever basically didn't do what they like this? I guess it just brings up this premise that, we grew up, you learn about checks and balances, you learn about that there's no person who's all powerful, that, you've got the different branches of government. And that's that you learn about checks and balances. And I guess what happens if he doesn't do it, then what? And I just, again, I'm having that same revelation I had as a young child, wait, that's even an option. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the best historical example we have is actually almost certainly apocryphal. So, there's a quote that is attributed to President Andrew Jackson that most historians, I think, now think he never said, which was after one of the Supreme Court's ruling in the Cherokee removal cases, where the court had at least mildly pushed back against efforts by the federal government to remove Cherokees from Georgia. Jackson is rumored to have said something like, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, has said what the law is. Now let's see him try to enforce it. And the thing about that quote, Karen, is even if Jackson didn't say it, it gets at something that is really important, but also really elusive, which is that the Supreme Court has no power to enforce its judgments, right? That enforcement of the court's judgments, both literally and practically, depends upon the political branches, depends upon the elected branches. And a really good example of this, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education, when the Supreme Court held in 1954 that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. That did not overnight end segregation in public schools. It did not automatically sort of force school districts throughout the country to integrate. It took a lot more work, including in one exceptional case, President Eisenhower literally sending the army into Little Rock to integrate at least some of Little Rock schools. And Karen, what that's getting at is that the Supreme Court really does depend for functioning on at least a reservoir of public support.
I just want to break this down because this is very surprising and shocking. So in state court or federal court at the district level, right, the trial level, if a judge makes a ruling and tells someone they have to do something and they don't do it, the judge holds them in contempt. They can even, fine them. They can put them in jail. There are enforcement mechanisms that trial judges have. But does the Supreme Court not have that ability? And not that they would, but I just theoretically, they truly have no power, no enforcement power?
I mean, not really. I mean, and even the trial courts. I mean, if you think about like a federal district judge who, you defy an injunction and a federal judge holds you in contempt, Karen, he's not going to arrest you himself, right? He's going to send a marshal, i.e. an employee of the executive branch, right? Or maybe a court security officer if you happen to be in the building to arrest you. But note the role that requires for the U.S. Marshal Service. So, we just sort of have always assumed that the political branches will, comply with, will do what they have to do to enforce contempt citations, to enforce judgments, to enforce judicial decrees, because, and this is the critical point, because of the political consequences of not doing so, right? That, throughout American history, no president has really been in a position to thumb his nose at a Supreme Court decision and get away with it. That's part of why Eisenhower has to send the army into Little Rock. He couldn't not without facing enormous and perhaps fatal political blowback, right? That's why President George W. Bush complied with the Supreme Court's 2008 ruling, holding that the Guantanamo detainees were entitled to access to the federal courts. It's why even Richard Nixon, in July of 1974, complied with the Supreme Court's decision that he had to turn over the Watergate tapes, even though he knew what that meant and he knew what was on the tapes. He couldn't not comply because that would have just accelerated his impeachment and his removal from office. And what's striking, Karen, is that was just a given, right, for so much of American history, so much that we never talked about it. Whereas now, I think it's not as obvious because,
Right.
The question is what would be the political blowback Trump would face? Would it be from his own party?
He's a lame
right?
duck, so it doesn't matter. He doesn't want to be reelected, or he can't, whatever, he can't.
He doesn't want to be reelected. He's not going to be impeached by a Republican House. He's not going to be removed by a Republican-controlled Senate, right? And part of what also complicates this is that you have, unlike in prior moments in American history, you have on the other side of the equation politically, Democrats, many of whom have spent the last 4, 8, 12 years, criticizing, at least in some cases, I think reasonably, the same Supreme Court, right? And so now you have the awkward possibility that the Supreme Court will rule against President Trump. Trump will tell him to pound sand, and the very same people who have spent the last decade, right, publicly criticizing the court, publicly calling into question the court's legitimacy and credibility, will be the only ones left arguing in favor of the court's precedents, of the court's decisions, of the court's judgments. That's exactly the scenario we ought to be worried about. And just to add one, sort of recent event, this did not get a lot of attention when it happened, but in January of this year, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 ruling, sided with the Biden administration in a dispute over razor wire that Texas Governor Greg Abbott had placed along the U.S.-Mexico border. The Biden administration wanted to remove the razor wire. Abbott wanted to block them. And the court, in a cryptic order that didn't have any opinion, said, yes, Biden administration, you can remove the razor wire. Karen, within like 3 hours of that decision, you had Texas Congressman Chip Roy, who I think is not radically out of the sort of the zeitgeist here, going on Fox News and telling Abbott that he should ignore the Supreme Court, right? And so, we already have in real time.
So what happened?
Examples of this. So, I mean, Abbott, it was the way that particular decision was structured. There was nothing Abbott could do to defy the Supreme Court. I mean, we were lucky that Chip Roy didn't know what he was talking about. But that happened, Karen, so quickly that Republicans turned on even this Supreme Court with a Republican supermajority. And I was really surprised at the time that didn't, get more attention. It didn't set off more warning bells, because that's the specter we ought to be worried about heading into a second Trump term where, Republicans will control the Senate, and it looks increasingly likely like the Republicans will also control the House.
Couple of more questions. So what do you think is the most, of all the things that Trump is talking about doing, okay, that he's either said or by the appointments he's making, there are certain positions that people have come out and said, this is what we are going to do, policy positions. Are there any that raise alarm bells for you that you think the Supreme Court might rule against, might rule against Trump and these policies? What are the policies that you think are most unconstitutional, frankly?
I mean, I guess the scary thing is we don't know yet, because we don't know exactly how far Trump will go. But of the things he's been talking about already, I think an effort to try to get rid of birthright citizenship for children of undocumented immigrants would be flagrantly unconstitutional, and indeed quite possibly something this Supreme Court would agree is unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment, Section 1, has birthright citizenship entirely to repudiate Dred Scott and the idea that people born to those who were enslaved might not be citizens. So I think birthright citizenship is one. I think trying to get rid of the civil service en masse within the executive branch even though there are a whole bunch of statutes that have been around since the 1880s, creating and instantiating the civil service, I think would be another. But who knows? I mean, if there's a lesson from the first Trump administration, it's that when President Trump gets ideas in his head, he tends not to worry that much about how legal they are. I mean, this is someone who declared a national emergency for the sole purpose of freeing up military construction funds that he could use to build the border wall. So I don't know that we know yet what exactly the crisis or the confrontation will be. But the reason why I think it's important to write about this and talk about it now is because I think it really reinforces why everyone, including Republicans and Democrats, should be invested in a Supreme Court that has a modicum of public credibility. Because, we can all imagine a circumstance where the court is going to come out the way we might want it to, and the president might say, well, I don't care. And the question is, who is going to be the force at that point in our political conversation that gets the courts back and that actually, creates the political pressure that requires the president to comply? I think it's been a long time since we've been in a position where that was a serious concern, but it's going to be a serious concern come January.
So it sounds like the Democratic governors, attorneys general, and that the states are going to be the ones that are going to have to fight this battle, right? Is that what you see being the front lines of this, or do you see other people?
I mean, I think the Democratic attorneys general, I think, left-leaning interest groups. But Karen, I think part of the point here is just how important it would be for some folks who are right of center to also be fighting on behalf of the Supreme Court, right? That if we get to a point where there's a conflict between the court and a Republican trifecta in the elected branches, it can't just be the Democrats, right, who are standing up for the court. And I think that's why I've been so worried, right, over the last 10 years about the court's own behavior, because the court has a responsibility to save its capital, right, to spend its capital if and only if it's necessary, and to build up, right, these reservoirs of support from across the political and ideological spectrum, entirely so that if we get to one of those moments, we get to one of those confrontations, you don't have a Trump who's in the same position as an Andrew Jackson. And I think the court itself has either been oblivious to this concern or hasn't cared about this concern or thinks this concern is overstated. And my fear is that, especially if there are no other political checks, especially if there's no Democratic control of the House, especially if the Republican majority in the Senate is enough to marginalize the more moderate voices like Elisa Murkowski, that's exactly when I think the Supreme Court is in perilous territory. And when I'd be really worried, Karen, in both directions. One, about what happens if the court rules against Trump and he ignores the court. But two, whether that specter might itself incentivize the court to pull its punches, right? And incentivize the court to not be as aggressive in pushing back against what it perceives to be unlawful behavior by President Trump because it fears the consequences. Neither of those, I think, are healthy for our system. And they're both traceable to how much the Supreme Court itself has done to erode its public support, to erode public credibility, to erode the belief that the justices are doing something other than voting their partisan political preferences.
Wow. I mean, it's really amazing that what we're going to turn to hopefully save democracy and save America is the very court that's created the scenario that we're in some ways. I mean, it's interesting, right? And I still believe in checks and balances, though. I really think in the end they're going to do the right thing. I really do. I can't imagine that they're going to allow a dictator. I just can't imagine it.
I mean, so I'll just say, I think it's important now more than ever to think about the court. The court is a they, not an it. And so, we're really talking about 9 different people. And And chances are, like the real, the people who are going to matter the most, I think, are the Republican appointees who are most likely to be inclined to push back. And so that's some combination of Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and maybe to a slightly lesser degree, Justice Brett Kavanaugh. But, Karen, I'm with you that I think that even this court, which I know a lot of folks have lost faith in, is going to find some actions of a second-term President Trump to be a bridge too far. I think that's inevitable. Maybe not the ones you and I would want them to, but more than none. And I think it's really important that folks understand the very fraught institutional politics that will happen in those cases, because I think that for the first time in a very long time, that court's going to have to be at least a little worried about how it's going to ensure that its mandate is enforced. And, what is really, I think, unfortunate about this entire conversation is, had the court treaded a bit more carefully over the past decade, had the court avoided looking so ideologically divided in all of the highest profile cases, maybe we wouldn't be in this position. I mean, maybe we would be in a position where the court still had more support even from its critics. The problem is that the more that the court's support only comes from its side of the political spectrum, the less power the court has to hold that side in check. And that's why I wrote the piece in the Times. And that's a point that I think we don't talk about enough and the court doesn't look out for enough. And I just hope that we don't find out in the next 4 years what the price is going to have been, right, for the court just really, I think, turning its back on the importance of wide spectrum public credibility for the institution at a time when it was less under threat.
I mean, ironically, if they rule against Trump, people are going to say, wow, even like it's so illegal. Like everyone kind of thinks Trump does things that are illegal, and so does the Supreme Court. But if they rule against him, they're going to be like, wow, that must really be illegal, because everybody kind of feels like they do his bidding. How hard is it to get a constitutional amendment? How hard, like, what is, like, do they have, I'm just wondering, like, do they have the ability to do that given the numbers and the power that they have?
I mean, an amendment, I think, is an even heavier lift, right? So any constitutional amendment requires 2/3 of both chambers of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. Hard to imagine a constitutional amendment that would even declare that it's November right now, getting that kind of support. So, I think the problem is that it is already, Karen, in one sense, too late to fix the real root problem here.
Well, I know we can't. I just want to know how dangerous, I'm just trying to play out, like, how dangerous is the Trump, like, is he going to be able to go that far? That's what I'm wondering.
And I think it depends on two things. I think it depends on whether there's going to be any effort to check him from within his own party. Are we going to see moderate Republican senators, whatever that means, in 2025, doing to Trump in his second term what John McCain and Lisa Murkowski and their ilk did during his first term, right, to hold him somewhat in check? Are we going to see any, sort of moderate Republicans in the House, right, where the Republicans' margin of majority might be razor thin, doing the same? And if the answer is no, that's when all the pressure shifts to the court. And I guess, like you, I actually have faith that there are 5 or more justices who will be heavily invested in, preserving our institutions, in maintaining the checks and balances, even as they understand them. This is why I think, Karen, it's so important for us to be talking now and not just then about how we're going to get out of the constitutional crisis that would come when a Supreme Court says, no, President Trump, you can't do that. And Trump says, who's going to stop me? That's what we should be worrying about. And that's what I wish the Supreme Court had been worrying about a little more, right, over the last decade.
Well, I'm so appreciative that you're taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule to talk about this with us, because we got to get the word out, and we've got to let people know who might be feeling a little bit disillusioned and a little bit, what's the point? There is a point, and a big point, and there are things we can do. We have to keep fighting for what we believe in, fighting for what's right, fighting for what's legal, And look, Trump's going to get away with a lot of stuff, and he has the right to, and nothing can happen to him because of the Trump versus United States immunity decision. I mean, that's is what it is. But the Constitution, as you said, it's hard to change. Hopefully he won't have the will to do it. And it does protect us from a lot of things. And so the hope is that the heroes of the next 4 years will be wearing robes all across the country, and including to the Supreme Court, because the system of checks and balances really is what this country was designed to do. And no one should be all powerful, right? Even if you have the will of the people, you still have to follow the law. That's what keeps our democracy going. And that's, again, that's what your article was so incredibly, why it hit me so hard, because it really shows how much everything depends on this social construct of all of us agreeing that we're going to do things like follow the law and support each other. And whether it's the peaceful transfer of power or not jaywalking, it doesn't matter what it is. The reason there's no chaos and the reason that there's no anarchy is because it's not because there's police and military on every corner. It's because we all have agreed that we are going to follow the laws, whether we agree with them or not. And we are going to do things lawfully. And that's what it means to be in a civilized society. And really what you pointed out in your article is just how incredibly not only fragile that is, but how we take that for granted. I mean, I'm someone who lives in this world of law and politics, and it just never dawned on me that that's even an option. Just like my sister who said to my mom, I'm going out anyway. It just never dawned on me, like, that's an option. You can do that. So I'm just so grateful that you came here and that you're sharing your knowledge, your information with everybody, because that's how we're going to keep our democracy, is by sharing knowledge, by not giving up the fight, by not giving up hope. And I hope you will come back when you have other things to talk about, because I want to help you spread the word far and wide. Steve Vladeck, any last words anything else that you want to share with everybody?
Just the less I come back, probably the better it is for our democracy. But I think if there's one last point, Karen, is that, we ought to be careful to distinguish between a Supreme Court that decides cases in ways we don't like and a Supreme Court that won't stand up for the rule of law. The former doesn't necessarily mean the latter. And I think, we're going to find out, I fear, in the next couple of years, that even a court that does lots of things we don't like is actually still really, really important to ensuring that other actors in our system can't do the same.
100%. But as you said, who's going to enforce it against Trump, right?
And therein lies the rub.
And that's the terrifying thing. So anyway, yeah, that's the thing we all have to really really keep our eye open on. So thank you, Steve, and go Mets, I guess.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.